So, uh, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar hosted by Slí Eile. So we are an anti-capitalist and anti-authoritarian direct action environmental group. I'm going to be providing a short introduction to today's topic. So we're going to be talking about a future worth fighting for and what it might look like. So there's a famous quote by Frederick Jameson that goes like this. Someone once said, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism." And this sums up how embedded capitalism is in our lives. This sentiment is made even more prevalent by the common suggestion that any deviation away from the neoliberal status quo will either lead to fascism or authoritarian socialism. And this idea that socialist revolutions failed because they were too extreme and not because they still carried a number of authoritarian, patriarchal, and colonial assumptions is continuously used to restrict our political imagination. But to give ourselves a chance to see beyond the current state of affairs, we need to realize that capitalism is more than just a system of profit accumulation based on exploitation. What creates the conditions for ever accumulating profits in the first place is the century-old and ongoing process of colonial expansion. So this is a process that is characterized by land seizure, the massacre and displacement of populations, the erasure of ancestral languages, spiritualities, and knowledge, and the disruption of ecosystems for extractive purposes. So to understand capitalism, we must interrogate our relationship with colonialism, with citizenship, and with racism. As expressed by the Zapatista slogan, "One no, many yeses," we need a united no to oppose the economic system of interwoven hierarchies that is destroying the planet. But beyond that, we need many yeses, many communities defining their own future on the basis of care and mutual aid instead of competition and hate. From one place to the next, we will have differing answers and they will inspire one another, but they will never fully transfer. And this absence of blueprints is not an absence of answer, but instead is the recognition that the answers are many and specific to each context. Many peoples are saying yes in their own unique way, and this is what we are going to talk about this evening. So this webinar is the final in the series, Decolonizing Ourselves, Building the World We Want to See. Over the past 6 weeks, we have hosted conversations on community organizing, grassroots resistance. We talked about the possibility of a sovereign and just food system and of a society that centers care with people that are already making this a reality on a local level. We have heard from communities that are on the front line of resistance to environmentally destructive projects and the threat of fascist and racist ideology across the political environmental spectrum. These conversations inform us on what a future worth fighting for might look like. So to give a bit of context to tonight's conversation, we will say that following the death of George Floyd, racism in the US and around the world has come into sharp focus, along with the dismantling of statues celebrating slave owners. The Black Lives Matter movement suddenly turned prison and police abolition into mainstream topics. In other words, institutions that are essential to capitalism's very existence saw a sudden loss in credibility. Imagining a world without police and prisons is now less easily derided as utopian because it appears more and more clearly as a necessity, along with the elaboration of transformative justice processes that keep conflict resolution within communities instead of referring to the state's inherently racist and patriarchal judicial system. In Ireland, the Black Lives Matter movement emphasized demands for the abolition of direct provision, and there has also been a call to educate ourselves on Ireland's own history of racism. Because to change the future, we must learn our past. So prior to the death of George Floyd, the world has also been turned upside down by COVID-19 and its disproportionate impact on already marginalized communities. This opened up conversations and activity around systemic racism, community support, rent strikes, and squatting. More broadly, the last few years have seen mass uprisings happen in Chile, Haiti, India, Iran, France, Hong Kong, and Sudan, to name only a few. And some of these uprisings were characterized by a deep distrust of political parties, as well as a commitment to decentralized and anti-authoritarian forms of organizing that can be seen as a prefiguration of how societies could organize without a state. So on a global level, we have also seen younger generations get involved in the environmental movement, and this has accelerated the pace at which capitalism's relationship to the planet is being questioned at a time where ecological collapse and climate change are underway, hitting the most marginalized and the global south the hardest. We are often guilty of overemphasizing the wrongs with our society, but we don't talk so much about what the future might look like. And in this webinar, we will draw on the insights generated over the past 6 thematic webinars, while learning from those who are working with the common scientific knowledge and ancestral wisdom available to build a different future outside of capitalist control. So this evening, we are speaking with Lucy O'Hagan. She is the founder of the Wild Awake Education and Forest School instructor, interested in rekindling ancestral knowledge and skills that are being lost. We are also speaking with Michael Loafer, who is a member of the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective, an anarchist group who seeks to empower people to make their own medicine. Thanks for joining us. And if you have, and to the listeners, if you have any questions for either of the speakers, please try to write them into the chat early, so we have a chance to ask them. And Slí Eile moderators will reserve the right to delete comments. So now I'm letting Anya start with the first question.
Thank you for that, Emmanuel. Just before we go to the speakers, I just wanted to say a few things about this evening's webinar. So A Future Worth Fighting For is about looking to new and to old ways of existing with each other and with the planet. Both of our speakers this evening present post-capitalist futures, and I for one believe that these conversations should be something that we are all engaged in, with many more ideas coming to the fore. Looking to a better future is what every Black Lives Matter protester and activist on the streets across the US and around the world are also fighting for. The struggle for racial equality and the end to the inhumane system of direct provision here in Ireland is the same struggle and is the same fight. So we're going to move over to our speakers tonight. Thank you so much, Lucy and Michael, for joining us. So I just, first of all, to kind of get a little bit more of an insight into your own work, could you tell us a little bit about what you do and, yeah, what you do and why you do it, I suppose?
Lucy, do you want to go first? Okay. So the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective is an anarchist collective. We work to try to get medicines and medical technologies to people who otherwise don't have access. Reasons for not having access typically are undercut by inaccessibility due to price or legality or lack of infrastructure. And our main tactic for all of that is to build do-it-yourself mechanisms so that people can build their own medical devices or make their own medicines by themselves, which allows one to bypass all of those barriers that are put up. And typically we use methodologies that are technology heavy, but trying to make the barrier to access as low as possible, so the people who are not technically inclined or have scientific backgrounds still have access, because again, that structure often lends to a system of excluding people. So we're working very hard to try and get everybody to have access, no matter what their background or situation.
Thanks, Michael. Super inspiring. Yeah, delighted to be here. My name is Lucy O'Hagan, and I'm the founder of Wild Awake. So I started Wild Awake nearly 5 years ago now, beneath a hawthorn tree in the Phoenix Park. So I started first of all with the forest school, and the forest school is still going, with some of the young people who have been coming back consistently for the past 5 years, which has been incredible to see and experience with them. So the forest school, we work with young people from 4 to 16 years old. And the idea of that is that it's child-led and learner-centered, and that the children are coming back regularly to a natural space, and learning skills, and inevitably learning lots of community building skills, consensus decision making, conflict navigation, boundaries, consent. Yeah, it's ever growing. And then the wider mission of Wild Awake is to rekindle cultural and environmental resilience through the learning of ancestral and place-based skills in nature. So yeah, I travel around the country and I teach a lot of our heritage and ancestral crafts to people. And I'm also the co-founder and collaborator of a Rites of Passage program with social ecologist Catherine McCabe. So we're seeking to provide initiatory experiences for youth aged 12 to 16 so that we can grow and sustain healthy cultures. So we teach them, again, nature-based and ancestral skills and all other kind of internal skills and interpersonal skills to better equip them with the future that we are fighting for. I also have a huge passion for rewilding, both cultural and ecological. So I run a donation-based Rewild in the City program each month, where I welcome people to the Phoenix Park. That is to build a rewilding movement that's based in ideas of anti-capitalism and anti-oppression. So those are a few of the many projects, but what's really alive for me at the moment.
Thank you for that. You both are doing such great work, and it's so important, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it. So we might go to Lucy next, if that's all right. So in an interview you gave recently, you mentioned how over time it has become more and more clear to you that the ancestral knowledge and skills you've learned need to be practiced in a communal way, supporting belonging and connection. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Thank you. So I suppose it's hard to know where to start with my journey of how I got into this, but definitely when I started to deepen my skills and my knowledge, the only place that I knew to look was in bushcraft schools. So I did a long-term bushcraft course, and the teacher who taught me was amazing. So this is not a reflection on him or his approach, but certainly the bushcraft world is a very macho, male-dominated, able-bodied, quite militarized world. And there's a train going past. It was somewhere where I never felt belonging at all, and I was always looking forward to the times where we would have to go and harvest things in the woods so that I could just go off and spend some time alone, where I was never actually alone, because obviously I'm surrounded by so many other beings. But it wasn't until I started to practice ancestral skills in communities of people who were striving for a world that was beyond capitalism, and challenged these oppressive frameworks that were present in the culture, that I really felt like, okay, I find my people, I find where I want to go with this. And I suppose it's worth saying at the moment I'm doing a week-long Stone Age residency in the Irish National Heritage Park. And, I kind of have been saying to people that it's the most inauthentic Stone Age project ever because I'm by myself. So it makes no sense and it's loads of work. So on the one hand, practicing these skills and being able to live with nature, it's takes loads of work. You have to gather firewood, somebody has to light the fire, you're foraging your food, there's all these different tasks to do. And it's just it's less crack, it's there's less time for connecting with other people, for singing, for having these important conversations, for having conflict, for navigating that together, for expressing and sharing grief. And we're wired to connect with each other, and we're wired to connect with nature. We're a part of all of this as well. So that was really one of my biggest realizations when I had spent so long learning skills, and then it suddenly struck me that actually they didn't mean anything, if I didn't have a community of people to practice them with. And I think that's one of the biggest kind of at the moment, it's this misconception that we can do all of this alone and that survival is enough. and it's kind of survival at the cost of healing and reparations. So yeah, if we're trying to create like a healthy restorative culture, for me, it's yeah, the only way to do that is in healthy community.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I suppose like a big challenge is to make this work more accessible and make it so that it's something that either every young person in the country can access, and we just live it. Like, yeah, like I often think about like how our ancestors lived all over the world, and to think that this is something that it's just so it's something that's how they lived, and that wasn't like it wasn't this radical, you know, reimagining. It wasn't anything theoretical, and it's been lost within the matter of a few decades in this country anyway. And you know, it's within living memory. So we just need to value that and to find the way, I suppose, again. Yeah, thank you for that, Lucy. So the next, we'll go to Michael. Western medicine is characterized by deeply racist and sexist history. Medical practice often overlooks patient consent and often collaborates to control women's bodies. Western medicine has also historically been characterized as by a tendency to downplay the pain of trauma experienced by women and people with a uterus. Could you speak to the potential of DIY medicine to overcome these aspects of medical science and practice?
Sure, yeah. I think that really strikes at the heart of a lot of issues that we all face. When we think about human rights as a whole, it becomes very clear very quickly that health has to always sit at the vanguard of that, because without health, everything else is impossible. And then when bringing one's focus to health rights, reproductive rights are clearly at the vanguard of that. And you can sort of see that, again, there's an antecedent there always. I mean, of course, when you discussing reproductive rights and the oppression of uterus owners, it's bizarre and tragic, because of course we all started there one way or another. And when think about the evolution of the oppressive mechanisms that have come through Western medicine, you can see that the mechanisms of control that have been developed, the most oppressive of which strike to the very beginnings of life. Not only in reproduction, but if you just think about the fact that in the mid-50s, there was a shift in that every human being born was de facto a patient to start with, that you were sick until proven otherwise, that birth had to happen in a hospital under the observation of an authority. And when you see questions of reproductive rights, you can see the roots of that often as coming from the tenets of monotheism, and how the questions of consolidations of power and trying to build mechanisms to rob people of basic freedoms and then sell them back manifests within that. And reproductive rights is sort of a perfect example, because it, in terms of like the most basic thing over which people should have autonomy, and taking that away and saying, well, if you'd like it back, you're going to have to play our little game, is a microcosm of the rest of health. Every time that you enter into a medical structure that manages to serve you, it's only because they took the freedom for you to do it yourself away and then said, well, if you come play by our rules and pay our fees and kowtow to our gods, then we'll let you have it back. So I think that at the core, when you look at self-empowerment, bodily autonomy, the ideas of do-it-yourself medicine, that the very first and most important thing is to look at reproductive rights and the ways that there can be a return to the states which existed previous to the medical infrastructure taking hold, where care was something that happened in a communal setting, where care was something that happened amongst people, where it was more natural to care for yourself and for people close by than to appeal to an authority to do it for you. And there wasn't an outsourcing of responsibility that then came at a price. So I think that, yeah.
So
reproductive rights are so key. Yeah, please.
Sorry, just your, I've been looking up into what the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective do and how you torrent, I suppose, pharmaceutical syntheses. I suppose, is that done in your opinion, or from your perspective, is the hope that that will be done collectively, like communally, that those, you've got, I suppose the idea of it, correct me if I'm way off the mark here, but you have designed a lab reactor that is made up of off the shelf parts that anybody, I suppose, could build, and then you synthesize the pharmaceutical, the medicines, and torrent them on your website. And I suppose, yeah, there's a much greater risk attached to that, rather than if, I suppose, it's done collectively and communally. And if, like, do you imagine some sort of like neighborhood-based kind of lab reactor, and people in the community kind of doing that?
Yeah, I think that it would be likely that it would manifest that way. The design goal was always centered around the idea of sort of an anti-scaling, that hopefully this would be cheap and simple and accessible enough that an individual could do it without the support of a community. That's a huge problem that Lucy spoke to, that in sort of our era, we have this terrible isolation where oftentimes we feel like and are struggling without support networks that were sort of de facto not too long ago. But it certainly would be significantly easier to have setups where there were people supporting one another, being able to lend resources and expertise in states of mutual aid to be able to build and develop whatever medicines and medical technologies were necessary. I mean, specifically, we focus a lot on reproductive rights. One of our main things that we focus on is trying to get mifepristone and misoprostol into the hands of people who need it, which is so key and so difficult, so unnecessarily in so much of the world. And it of course is easier in a communal setting. Oftentimes, we did a workshop in Pittsburgh about a year ago, I guess it was, where people came in and made their own abortion pills in a little workshop. It didn't take a whole lot, but what really made it possible was that there were a lot of people helping each other. And you can do it alone, but lots more trial and error and lots more frustration, lots more time, lots more energy.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think when the state limits access to really important drugs, like access to abortion pills, like in Ireland, we've had up until very recently, we've had really a complete ban on abortion pills. And in that vacuum, there was a huge amount of solidarity and support that came, that was shown from women, women in England, or groups in England and groups in Amsterdam specifically. And all of this was really risky because obviously of the legality of it, but it's something that doing this kind of thing alone is just, it's so much more difficult. Like you need that
hopefully
support.
it's still possible, yeah. Hopefully it's still possible, and hopefully the tools make it possible, but also make it easier on a communal level for the community to be mutually supporting.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Michael. So we might go to Lucy next. So this is a bit of a loaded question. And this is around, I suppose, our own history with the land. And so colonialisation affects so much physical geography. In Ireland, so much of what was Indigenous was associated with poverty and hardship and the past. Over the course of a generation, for example, the Irish language was replaced with English, as well as different structural reasons like the penal laws. A lot of the reason for this was because the idea of English was that it brought prosperity and opportunity, and it became the language of a brighter future that parents wished on their children. They didn't want to be associated to the language of the past, which was of old Ireland and how difficult it was for them. And the same can be said for knowledge and skills that existed and were passed down for generations. We inherited from the colonizers, as is often the case with colonialism, and the British capitalist class, of course, a sentiment that despised the collective memory of living with the land. Do you recognize these effects on colonialism and capitalism on our relationship with ancestral skills and our connection with the land? I suppose through doing your work and the groups that you've been involved with.
I lost Lucy. Is anybody else able to see her? She's not on my board anymore.
Oh, have we lost Lucy? Oh no.
Hopefully she'll reconnect in a minute.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear her address that.
Yeah. Okay, well, we might. Okay, well, hopefully we get Lucy back. Yeah, because that's a bit of a loaded question, and I'd love to hear a response. Okay, well, we might just go back to you, Michael, if that's
sure. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
And if she does bounce back, I'll pause and we can. Oh, wait, hang on.
Do we have her?
Hi, sorry. I think that was my internet.
At what stage did we lose you there?
I heard up until about English. The
language. Okay.
Yeah,
do you want me
language.
to? Okay, sure. I'll just quickly do it again.
Sorry.
Not at all. Okay, so I suppose the question is basically around colonialism and capitalism, and how our history, our collective history, has affected our relationship with ancestral skills and our connection with the land.
Yeah, tread carefully. I always find it really interesting when I began to learn about ancestral skills, because I was brought up in Belfast. I grew up in a very sectarian town, and it never felt safe for me growing up to speak Irish, to learn Irish, to have any kind of relationship with Irish culture. It was always something that definitely needed to be hidden. So when I moved to Dublin and then settled here, it was kind of, for me, it was like this reweaving of a relationship that actually, you know, relationship with the land is so much older than the state, and that it comes directly from the land itself, and from our culture that we are creating. So yeah, that's been a really interesting journey. And then that's been really interesting to witness in other people that I've been teaching who are, you know, from the state of Ireland. And yeah, just like the collective trauma of the colonization project here, where people have so much mistrust for the land. I particularly see that when I teach about foraging, you know, like people's lack of knowledge and fear around eating things from the land, or yeah, making medicines from plants as well. So that's been really interesting to observe. And also, you know, today, like, well, and this past week, I feel like I've just been continually dispelling these myths of prehistory and these myths of our ancestors that people have come here with. And, you know, I see it here as well. There's things like phrases like the march of progress, you know, around, and this idea of our time and progress being linear, and that suddenly now we've reached a point where, yeah, we're in a technological age where we've made it and this is the best we've ever been. And obviously we all know that that's not true at all. And, you know, here I'm hanging out in the Mesolithic area and people are coming in and it's, you know, oh, this is horrible. And, you know, well, people live this way. And it's like, well, we lived this way for, you know, about 6,000 years. And we don't know why we turned to farming. You know, it was a very gradual process, but we know by looking to persistent hunter-gatherers around the world who still live this way that they have so much more leisure time. So yeah, yeah, it doesn't really make sense. So it's interesting to hear this from people, that they believe suddenly that we're living in this golden era. And yeah, I mean, it's good to hear you talk about like this idea of people's relationship with indigeneity as something that was harsh and hard and associated with poverty. And, you know, like, I'm not here to romanticize the past. And I think that, you know, there's quite often these two extremes of either really romanticizing it or really, you know, demonizing it to a certain extent, or it being something that we're fearful of. Similar with the word wild as well. But really it's, you know, like the knowledge and the skills that we had before and the belonging that we felt to a place and to a community before were what we needed to thrive and to live in such close connection with the earth and with ourselves for so long. I have connections with a herbalist in Donegal. She's a native Irish herbalist called Margaret Kitty. And she's a native Irish speaker. She doesn't really know the English names of plants. She's never learned from a herbalism book. She didn't realize that there were books written about herbalism. And she's been the healer for that area for her life. And she learned it from her mother, who learned it from her grandmother. So for me, this was like a really interesting exploration in what it means to be Indigenous to place. You know, there's so much romanticism around this word of Indigenous as well here. And it's like, in so many ways, we're so far from what that word means. And for me, it's like, you know, we can't even begin to think about reclaiming that word while we're still oppressing and exploiting Indigenous people, both here in Ireland and around the world. But like this woman is, you know, what I would consider to be Indigenous to Ireland. And
yeah, what's the yeah, because I know what you mean, and I use that word very like skeptically, because there is that kind of appropriation. And I think you've talked about it before, about appropriating Indigenous cultures from other parts of the world. But yeah, what would the definition for you be? And how do you think that word could be used like incorrectly in Ireland, or like
yeah. Yeah, it's something I grapple with quite a lot, like in particularly in you know, like these kind of neo-pagan spiritual circles that I sometimes find myself in. And I can understand, you know, like people are really hungry for a deeper connection to the land, and that's something that was, you know, wasn't completely erased with colonialism. You know, we still have people like Margaret Kitty on this land, and there are still but I definitely use that word very sparingly, and in a way that, you know, we can aspire to be. Yeah, I'm still grappling with it, you know. But certainly in Ireland, you know, like the Irish travellers are the Indigenous ethnic minority of this land, and before we begin to even start to think about calling ourselves Indigenous, it's like we need to face up to the racism that they're experiencing all the time, and that you know, their lands, their sites have still not been given back, you know. And yeah, I mean, it's great to see people, you know, planting trees and talking about rewilding, but it's like at whose expense as well? You know, is it not just another perpetuation of colonialism as well? So yeah, it's really tricky. And yeah, appropriation is something that I think we need to be continuously mindful of in this work.
Yeah. And thank you so much for bringing in that point about travelers and travelers' experience today. Like I think in the last maybe 10 years, there's been a real kind of appropriation of traveler culture, and yeah, it's something we should be aware of, because today, I mean, it's not something of the past. I mean, travelers face a huge amount of discrimination and racism, structurally and culturally. So yeah, so thank you for that.
If I can jump in, it's just to say that just to mention that we've also seen the word Indigenous being weaponized by the far right recently for anti-immigration purposes, to basically present immigration as a form of colonization, and yes, using the word Indigenous basically for anti-immigration purposes. So that's another misuse of the word.
Yeah, can I like just add to that, like during the Black Lives Matter ongoing protests, and but in the beginning I kind of didn't realize, it was a blind sight of me, of this part of my business, that people who promoted Celtic indigeneity and Celtic spirituality would hold such far right beliefs. And yeah, I was challenged with that on one of my posts, and was really shocked. But you know, it exists, like, of people in, you know, like these Norse or Viking movements as well. So of course it exists here in Ireland as well, and this idea of Ireland for the Irish. And it's just yeah, it's really sickening when we consider what what we went through as a nation, but that, like, we can't romanticize the past, you know. Like, the colonizers are very adept at being colonized, and colonized can become colonizers as well. So yeah, we know this. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Emmanuel.
Okay, I think we've Michael is back with us.
Yeah, sorry about that. You know, the glory of technology bringing us together sometimes.
It's wonderful. Okay, so the end of capitalism is often understood by white and middle-class Westerners as synonymous with the end of modern medicine and the industrial processes it relies on. The word picture is one where access is ever more efficient. Where access to ever more efficient treatments would disappear, and where life expectancy would go back to the same levels as they were around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Can you say what is wrong with this picture, and what healthcare could look like in a post-capitalist future and post-colonial future?
Yeah, and I think I think this mirrors a lot of what Lucy just addressed, or the bits of it that I managed to hear about this, the danger of either romanticizing or vilifying the past. So often we get locked into this paradox, this fallacious line of reasoning that you mentioned, because we're just used to the way things are currently. There's this sensibility that the infrastructure that exists to bring westernized medicine is the thing that protects us, when in fact that infrastructure is there to perpetuate itself in fact. And the great evidence for how bizarre of a concept this is that if you pick up a book on pharmaceutical science and just flip to a random entry, you have a 3/4 chance of landing on something that when you get to the part that describes how it was discovered or the mechanism of action, the entry will say, the mechanism of action of this drug is still not understood, and this drug was developed from a folk remedy that came from such and such culture. And this is far more typical than not. And we're sort of bred to believe that pharmaceuticals sort of fall from the sky, that there's this magical invincibility that factories that manufacture them have. When in fact, the reason that all of the complex machinery, the complex systems that are built to hold up those systems are in place because of the question of selling things and of scaling things to make sure that things can be sent across the world and stored properly. And all these problems are very difficult ones to solve. When we talk about the future and we talk about dealing with a post-capitalist era where we're manufacturing our own medicines, most of the problems that those systems were designed to address go away. A great example of that, again, mirrored by the workshop that we did on abortion drugs. If you were to sit down and try and build a factory to manufacture abortion drugs, it would be a tremendous undertaking because of the difficulties that you have to deal with just from chemical engineering and then quality control and making sure that things work. If you're making a single pill, you don't have most of those problems. You don't have to worry about mixing ingredients on a large scale, which is a very, very non-trivial problem when you're dealing with, many kilos or liters of reagent. If you're making a single pill, you measure out how much active ingredient you want to go into that pill, and then you mix it in with whatever buffer and binder you have when you press a certain pill. And the thing that gets me excited about that is that there's this wonderful possibility that we can move forward with all of the benefit of reflecting on the knowledge that has come with all of these structures that have had these unfortunate side effects, and we don't have to reject them. We don't have to let those fall by the wayside. We can merely fold those in to the rest of the things that we utilize, and they can exist harmoniously. Fundamentally, there's not really any difference between going to a willow tree and going to the aspirin bottle. The same thing's occurring. One, again, we're taught to trust because it has a packaging that says some authority figure told you that this was okay. But if we're able to move forward with a fundamental understanding of, as best we have it, of mechanisms, both chemical, biological, ecological, then these things can come together harmoniously, and we can benefit from the old knowledge and the newer knowledge simultaneously. And so I think that's it's an important fallacy to point out, that in a post-capitalist environment, we can have all of the things that are seen as benefits of medical science, and not just as good as they are now, but better.
Yeah. And I suppose you've mentioned about like the ownership of science. It's something that should be a human right, and it should be for the common good. So it's, I suppose, like democratizing science, that it should serve the needs of people and of the planet, of life, and not as this like capitalist instrument that
absolutely
serves profit interests only.
Yeah, and as an anti-authoritarian structure, I think that that's really important to identify. So often we have this deification of science, that it exists outside of everything, and that science understands things, when in truth, if one is to be a scientist in the true meaning of the word, it is to understand that you don't understand anything, and that we are telling ourselves good stories that allow us to make predictions sometimes, but that what's really happening is that we're just looking for patterns, and it's no different than any other system. I mean, the Big Bang is just our current creation myth. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's my favorite too, but let's not shit ourselves. It's just a creation myth. It's just a story we tell ourselves to try and explain things. And such as it is with all of science.
Yeah. And all religion and all things. There's just so much we don't know, and we can pretend that we understand things, but we really don't. There's just and
the embracement, and the embracement of that, I think, is where the real power lies, is that people can be empowered by taking on that wonder. Again, when looking at monotheism, came out of the suppression of the feminine because it was mysterious, and that was seen as threatening. Not understanding something that is, again, to use that word, wild, that is impossible to control. And instead, if we can say, no, we like that. That's a beautiful thing. That's a wonderful thing. That's something that makes things possible. Let's have more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the final question. Like, where's that time went? It's just like 30 minutes has just flown past. But yeah, so the last question, I suppose, is for both Lucy and Michael. It's in the frame of that. I feel like maybe it seems as if we're staging some sort of debate here, some sort of debate around what is the best future path, and that these two future paths are somehow like competing and in conflict with one another. So like speaking at that, I suppose, so you both represent what is framed as two competing future paths, and oftentimes proponents of these future paths fail to see the role that both of them can have in a post-capitalist and decolonial future. What are your thoughts on this polarization of these two worldviews, and how do you think technology and science can complement a more localized degrowth future, and vice versa? So I don't know whoever wants to go first there.
Well, I've been talking, so I'll defer.
Yeah, I can go. I kind of feel like this question is above my pay grade, but I'll go for it. Yeah, I mean, I feel, I'm a bit of a killjoy with this. Like, I don't feel like we're in that it's conflicting. And for me, like imagining this is like it's reclaiming the parts of that we want, that we can use to work towards the future that we want to see, that is like post-colonial, that is like anti-capitalist, that is anti-racist, that is anti-oppressive, and we need all parts of it. And I really believe that we've created all parts of it for a reason. Where I see my work coming in is like that sense of belonging, that sense of place, that sense of connection that we all need. You know, we've evolved out here for thousands and thousands of years, and in order to create the world that we want to see, we also need to be looking after ourselves, which is where access to the outdoors and diversifying the outdoors becomes so important, because this shouldn't just be available to, you know, white, middle class, able-bodied, straight people. And that's something that I've really been examining a lot in the past few months in my own work of you know, really looking at the movements that I'm a part of, and, you know, noticing who's not there, you know, and who's not represented, and without making an assumption that everybody wants to do what I want to do. It's hard for me to understand why people don't all want to do this, but I get that there's lots of different barriers to this happening. But yeah, like, I think it's just so important for our physical health, our mental health, our spiritual health, that we're all, yeah, like feeling this sense of place and this sense of belonging, whether it's like in nature or in a community, and building that trust with each other and with the land. Yeah, I want to let Michael speak, or somebody speak, and then maybe we can have a bit of a back and forth, but that's where I'm at with it.
Sure, but I mean, I'll start just by echoing a lot of that. I think that there's real importance in allyship, and that there's a criticality to being more embracing and less rejectionary of different strategies and tactics. The real strength, I think, can come from understanding that there are many tools, and that if we're using them all, then we have a shot at this. And I think that one of the great weaknesses that comes from a lot of radical movements is being rejectionary. And you often see people who are techno fetishists who will reject what's seen as primitivist, and vice versa, when really there's this real magical coevolution that can happen between the movements, as exemplified by the fact that there are so many medicines that are being rediscovered through looking at old texts, indigenous practitioners of medicine who have passed things down. A classic example is some of the therapies that are being developed with ibogaine. I won't get into the technicalities of it, but it's a traditional alkaloid that comes from a plant in West Africa, and has helped with opiate addiction. And nobody really understands how it works, but there's something that's going on. And the beautiful interplay between being able to use more modern tools to try and look at things and do some analysis, and maybe tell ourselves a story about how it might work, and also being able to look through the lexicon of the past and say, what are the things of which we do not speak as much as we used to? And you see this everywhere. Again, exemplified in reproductive rights. I mean, women have been having abortions as long as they've been having sex with men. There's a long, long history there, and so much of it is so hard to find record of. And yet it's out there. And so again, if these things can merge more, we can use strengths on both sides and help each other. That's what I dream about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's definitely a rejection, or there's people are very tied to strategy, and what will work and what won't work. And yeah, I completely agree that we can't afford to reject what we don't feel comfortable with. And yeah, that question was a bit of a, sorry, Lucy, to put you in the spot there. That was a bit of a, I don't know. I think it's just, I mean, it's a polarization that occurs, and it's kind of just bullshit. And I think you both said that beautifully.
Yeah, I think Lucy spoke very well to that. There's a natural harmony, and it's a falsehood when people try to stir up controversy just for its own sake.
Yeah, one thing that I find really interesting in this time, one of the skills that I teach is fish skin tanning, and it's such an ancient skill, and I taught it online on a webinar. I've been teaching, we facilitated a 9-month-long rites of passage program. And the end of that program was an initiatory experience for the youth. And one of the struggles with rites of passage is that, there's the 3 stages, and the last stage is that integration, where the young people are recognized by their community as a different person, as somebody who has new responsibilities, as somebody who needs to be treated differently, and who has more. So that had to take place online, and what happened there was that the power was put into the hands of the young people and their families to hold ceremony together. So I'm seeing all of these amazing things that can happen online, not to mention the accessibility of being online if you have access to it, both from the outdoors can be very exclusive to people who are not able-bodied or who do not have the time or financial abilities to make that commitment to be outside. So yeah, for me, it's just amazing. I want so many more people to be aware of this work, to be aware of rewilding, so to be able to do that across time zones and oceans, and seemingly some kind of barrier is just, it's a blessing. It's brilliant.
Yeah, time zone is right. What time is it where you guys are?
9 o'clock, 9 p.m.
It's just closing in on 4 a.m. here in Singapore.
Oh,
wow.
You're committed.
Yeah, well, you guys are important, and I was really honored to be included. So I'm happy to be here with you guys, even in the middle of the night.
Thank you. Okay, well, just before we wrap up or we go to the questions, I just wanted to say a huge big thank you to both Lucy and Michael. Your contributions are really really valuable for this webinar, but also just generally. You're both really clearly really committed to making your fields really accessible. And yeah, thank you for joining us this evening. So I think Emmanuel is going to read out some of the audience's questions.
Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna read out some of the audience questions and mix that in with some other extra questions that we had. So there's a question for Lucy. Lucy, you mentioned something about how some people involved in Celtic spirituality circles are revealing themselves to have some tendencies that are exclusionary and even sometimes racist. Some of them are also buying into conspiracy theories that are dangerous. Could you speak to how those of us involved in work such as ancestral skills that has some overlap with these wills can make sure to distance ourselves from these tendencies?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, I should begin by saying that from what I've experienced, it's been a minority, but that doesn't mean that it is a minority. for me, like what has been important is being explicitly anti-racist and anti-oppressive in everything that I do. Yeah, like, and you know, this has been so much of my unlearning as well in the past few months of being afraid to say things or being afraid to share things that support the Black Lives Matter movement or Indigenous people for fear of, you know, for fear of being perceived a certain way, for fear of my business being damaged. And yeah, that is like my own, yeah, that's like white supremacy working through me, you know, that's my own white fragility. And yeah, so I think like being explicit in our commitment to supporting people and supporting marginalized groups, and yeah, I suppose just like looking for authenticity, you know, like questioning where your information is coming from, and recognizing that all of us can like have access to teachings from the land as well, that we don't need to be going through some kind of higher power. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it makes sense, and it ties back into things that were said in previous webinars on ecofascism, for example, where we were saying that basically our environmentalism or our ecological struggles have to be anti-fascist and anti-racist explicitly, otherwise we're missing the mark. So moving on to the next question, this one is for Michael. So during the COVID outbreak, we've seen states respond to the pandemic in very careless ways. And do you feel like you see more people recognizing the need to make healthcare a community issue? Could you outline what an anarchist response would look like to a pandemic? And would you say that your collective has learned something from observing people's reactions at the community level during this pandemic?
Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's sticky. There are multiple parts to that. So many. When you have any catastrophe, I think it's important to look for all of the things that had to go wrong in order for it to occur, right? Because if you have, it's always tempting to sort of point out a particular thing that was amiss, that was, you know, something to blame and focus on. But there's a multi-layered stack of issues that come to the forefront when you're analyzing catastrophe. That certainly is the case in the case of COVID. And there has been a lot of grassroots organizing and community-based support systems for trying to survive the outbreak. The thing that seems so instructive is that it happened out of need and desperation, sort of, which is often antithetical to what a lot of people suggest the structure of anarchism is, right? People often dismiss it as being very idealistic, when in reality, anarchism is a matter of pragmatism. It wasn't born out of an ideological movement. It was born out of a need for survival. And one thing that has enheartened me often during this difficult time is that no longer will the discussions get stalled around anarchism when people say, oh, but that's never actually worked in practice. That's just a theory. And although there are plenty of examples to which you can point, or to which you could point already, the manifestation of mutual aid surrounding the pandemic has been so universal that nobody has not seen it work yet. And it's so wonderful to see those things manifesting. And in terms of community, the way people built sanctuaries to support people who were immunocompromised, being able to share services, to be able to keep each other fed and keep each other safe. And ultimately, from our work at Four Thieves, it's been difficult because oftentimes people have come to us and said, oh, you guys must know the secret as to how to fix this, right? And we've had to say, look, we really don't. It doesn't seem like anybody knows. And in fact, it even seems like the people who claim that they know don't know. And the one place that I find a little bit of solace in the difficulty and confusion at looking at COVID and the very strange way that it interacts with the human biology, where there are all of these effects that nobody's really understanding why they manifest the way they do or what the mechanism of action is that there'll be some acknowledgement that really things are far more complicated than our current understanding allows for. And looking at specifically how COVID seems to destroy all of these different systems of the body that aren't typically thought of as connected, that maybe this will give rise to a more holistic view of human biology and maybe of science in general and maybe of knowledge in general, that really we need to stop thinking in this deconstructivist sort of way that we can break things down into component parts and examine them and that's sufficient, but really that we have to look at systems and the way they interact with each other and that they have this complex structure that is self-reflecting and that we need to think in a more sophisticated way to really be able to do good for ourselves and each other.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Michael. Yeah, I really like what you said about anarchism being born from pragmatism and need. And it was interesting to see a lot of people who never have described what they were doing as direct action basically start making masks at home and then distributing them and building memes to fight on a communal level this pandemic. So
yeah, I mean, anarchism ultimately is an attempt to answer the question, what do you do when help's not on the way?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm going to go to the next question. So this is for Lucy. So access to land, resources, and knowledge that would be necessary to empower people to build communities autonomous from states is often restricted in racialized ways. This translates into colorblind and escapist calls to buy a house, a patch of land, and practice permaculture while waiting for the collapse of states. This is similar to the survivalist worldview that is rooted in white supremacist and macho ideas. Do you have any thoughts on this, especially with regards to the inaccessibility of land and knowledge to a huge portion of the population?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Yeah, I mean, it's really tempting, you know, it's really tempting to leave everything and to move away. And like when I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking how, you know, if people do choose to do that, that they are creating a space that is welcoming to everybody, you know. And how permaculture was described to me in the past was like creating a parallel, like the system we are in a collapse, you know. So yeah, if people are creating those spaces, I would hope that those are spaces that are ultimately going to be open to lots of other people to come to. Yeah, I'm also like thinking a lot around like, yeah, the injustices that are happening to marginalized community and the earth are interconnected. And how, like, yeah, we need to be centering the voices of Indigenous people and marginalized people. You know, these are the people that are surviving in the face of huge adversity. And it's worth remembering that, like, while we are in a collapse, like, they have experienced many collapses throughout their lives. So they're the people that we should be looking to for learning in this time. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that right now.
Oh yeah, I think that's very important to keep in mind, because it's all too often we hear this idea that the state is just going to collapse on its own, and we don't need to worry about the state, but just focus on building our own autonomy without really paying attention to what the state is doing. But of course, this is forgetting the fact that the states will try to reassert their legitimacy as long as possible, and they will do that by becoming more and more racist and more aggressive. So yeah, again, it comes back to environmentalism has to be anti-fascist and anti-racist, and it has to put the voices of the most affected first.
Yeah, I really appreciated the webinar on ecofascism, and it's something that's coming up a lot in my work right now, and particularly around rewilding. And I think, like, it's important for me to, like, really state that for me, like, rewilding is about, you know, if it's not decolonial in nature and an ethos, then it's just another colonial project, and it's just another, like, project of going in and buying up huge bits of land that many Indigenous people might be living on, that's further alienating people from the land. There's a guy called Peter Michael Bauer in Rewild Portland. I really appreciate the work that he does around rewilding, and his definition of rewilding, which I really subscribe to, is living a life in service to the land and ecological community of your place. And with that definition, we can all be rewilding. And it's like, yeah, we really need to be seeing how ecofascism and colonialism and capitalism shows up in these spaces, and how, yeah, rewilding can just be co-opted by capitalism again. And we see that a lot, particularly in the Rewilding Europe network, where there is so much talk around, like, overpopulation and sterilization, and it's just yeah, that's like, obviously definitely not the rewilding that I promote. And I think it's really important for me to, like, and for people who are involved in rewilding in this way, to reclaim that narrative and that word.
Thanks for that. So I think we have one last question for Michael. So yeah, it's about modern medicine, which is often seen as requiring a lot of expertise. And so we're often discouraged to engage in DIY practices and usually safety issues are invoked. And so one question we wanted to ask was, what gave you the confidence as a collective that you could tackle this and that you could find ways to provide instructions for people to access and safely use these drugs, which are otherwise unaffordable? And how do you think that this confidence can spread?
I think confidence is a good word for it. It's really a key thing, because the greatest barrier ultimately to people making their own medicine is being scared into a mode of trusting authority and deciding that you're not good enough and that somebody else's opinion is going to be better than your own. And that is so endemic, and it's so dangerous. And a few years ago, I was at just this wonderful anarchist conference in Pittsburgh called Please Try This at Home. They'd been two, this was the first one. And somebody called me out and said, look, this is really easy for you to say. You have all of this privilege, you're white, you have a PhD, all of this is very accessible to you, but what about all the people that you're working to try and provide these tools for? What makes you think that this translates? And it really gave me pause. It's an important thing to think about. And the word confidence, I think, is appropriate, but I might even use the word arrogance, because oftentimes there's this great barrier of like, this is done by specialists, and I've gotten that treatment as well from professional chemists that I've gone to and said, look, I'm working on this problem, I'd like some help, I'd be curious as to your perspectives. They often say, look, you can't do that, that's just not possible. And the arrogance afforded to me by privilege allowed me to say, really, watch me, I'm gonna do it, I don't care. And that that was an incredibly powerful tool. And what I hope to continue to do is to try to allow that to spread and proliferate that confidence by trying to break down the illusion of barrier between people who are dubbed as worthy or important by the establishment of science, saying these people have letters after the name, or these people are rich or white or male, or have titles, and to look and say, those people are just people, and they're doing things, and there's no reason that you can't either. And so to the large part of the work that we do at For Thieves specifically is to try to ease people's lack of confidence in themselves, because science is so exclusionary and is sort of raised to this apotheotic level. It really seems that science has in a lot of ways taken the place of the church in modern times. There's this way that you can be ordained to participate, and it has ultimate authority, which you must obey. It is truth. When somebody says something is scientifically proven, the conversation just stops. And looking at those sorts of things is so heartbreaking, because again, science is a great tool, but we have to recognize that it's a tool, and the central tenet of the scientific method is repeatability in a universal sense. And we really have to work to practice that, to say, if you're really a scientist, if you really want to call yourself a scientist, you need to be able to put things into a context where they're usable by anybody. If you're saying this is a repeatable result, but it's only repeatable by people who are very wealthy and have very extensive labs and have letters after their name and have authority from the state to utilize these chemicals and these parts of nature to manipulate living organisms, then you're not really doing science. You're just sort of making yourself feel good with scientific tools that you've hijacked. And so I hope to see things become more universal, and I think it's possible, and I'm hopeful, and I'm going to keep trying.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. Yeah, I think we've seen lately a lot of conservatives cloaking themselves in the mantle of science, but not really, but without there being any evidence supporting their views. And instead, yeah, I think there can be, I think that science, there's this great book by Welcomer, Breaking Sweetgrass, where she talks about the compatibility of the scientific method with indigenous knowledge, ancestral knowledge. And there's a wonderful chapter where she uses the format of a scientific study, but expresses it using the the language of the using metaphors of the Patwatomi people, and
Nice.
it's a really wonderful book. So I think that's the end of the questions that we have. So I think maybe Anya, do you want to move on to the conclusion?
Yeah, just I suppose before we close up the webinar, thank you again to our speakers. This is the final webinar in a series of webinars that we've been having over the last 7 weeks. And we've had conversations from organizing at the margins, feminist economics, the food system, food sovereignty, ecofascism and racism in environmental movements. And yeah, we've had some really interesting conversations with speakers who are out organizing and collectivizing and who are creating knowledge in their different areas. So that we have a better understanding of the world, to undo the systems of oppression and to build something better. So yeah, I think it goes without saying that it's been a really interesting few weeks, and on behalf of everyone at Slí Eile, we've really enjoyed hosting these conversations, and we feel very humbled and honoured to have shared these spaces with some really, really great people who are also representing different communities around the world and are doing really, really great work. So yeah, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the lovely musicians that we've had on almost every week. Thank you to people in Slí Eile who have been working away behind the scenes to make sure all of the technology is good and is happening, and everybody on social media, because that's a really full-time job. And it's not for everyone. Thank you to people who have watched and who's tuned in every week and who have put your questions in for the speaker. They're a really important part of the webinar, and yeah, so really thank you for making that effort. If you want to follow Slí Eile, we are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can also message us if you would like to be added to our mailing list, and we'll keep you up to date on what we're up to next, and when our next open meeting will take place, so you can get involved in the group if that's something you'd like to do. So I think that's about it. I don't know if I've missed anything there, or if anybody else wants to say anything.
I just want to say thanks so much for having me, and it's been so great to hang out with you guys. And Lucy, it was so great to meet you, and thank you so much for everything you do.
Yeah, likewise. It's just I'm so excited that there's an organization like Slí Eile in Ireland right now, and I'm so excited to see what you do next and what we do collaboratively. Such an important movement. So thank you for all of your work. And yeah, Michael, I really hope that you make it to Ireland someday and we can all hang out together. Your work's so inspiring. So
me too. I hope we can all hang out. That'd be great.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
And
thank you.
Bye.
mm-hmm.
Bye.
Bye.